Pull out your driving license and look at the name printed on it. That name is older than the house you live in, older than the road running past it, and in many cases, older than the very language you use to say it out loud. The words making up your surname were already being spoken in a Britain that hadn't yet finished deciding whether it was Saxon, Norman, Danish, or Welsh, and a striking number of those words haven't meaningfully changed since. Surnames in England became roughly fixed and hereditary sometime between the Norman conquest and the closing decades of the 1300s. By the time of Richard II's poll tax in 1381, most ordinary English families already had a settled second name and were passing it down through the generations. In Wales, that same shift didn't fully complete until the 1600s. And in Ireland, through a genuinely strange quirk of history, the oldest hereditary surname anywhere in these islands was already in continuous use a full 60 years before the Normans ever set foot on English soil. Here are 15 surnames you could still encounter on an ordinary Tuesday morning while standing in a supermarket queue, and every single one of them is older than the country we're currently living in. Some of these names began as jobs, some began as insults, and one began as a job title before eventually ending up wearing a crown. Let's count them down. Number 15, Cooper. A cooper built barrels for a living. The word comes from the Middle English cooper, and it appears as an occupational surname in records dating back to around 1176. In a country that ran almost entirely on beer, ale, salted fish, gunpowder, and water that had to be hauled and stored, the cooper was the person who built the container used for nearly everything liquid or dry that a household owned. A village with no cooper was functionally a village with no working kitchen. The trade itself lasted roughly 900 years in Britain. Nobody can say exactly how much longer the surname will outlive it. There are tens of thousands of coopers across the United Kingdom today, and it's safe to say that almost none of them have ever actually built a barrel. Number 14, Wright. This name comes from the Old English rita, meaning a maker or craftsman working in wood or metal. A wheelwright built wheels, a wainwright built carts. A playwright, in a slightly different sense of the same word, builds plays instead. The surname on its own appears in English records as far back as the 11th century, and today it ranks as roughly the 17th most common surname in Britain. The Wright brothers, who built the first successful airplane, were of course Americans, but the surname they carried with them to Kitty Hawk was pure Anglo-Saxon, and it meant, quite literally, people who build things. Number 13, King. You didn't actually have to be one. This surname comes from the Old English signing, and the men who first carried it were, almost without exception, not royalty at all. It could belong to the man who played the king in a local Easter mystery play, to someone whose bearing struck his neighbors as grander than his actual station in life deserved, or to whoever won the local King of the May contest one particular summer and kept the nickname permanently afterwards. It appears as a surname from the 11th century onward. There are tens of thousands of kings walking around Britain right now. None of them are kings. Number 12, Shepherd, sometimes spelled shepherd. This traces back to the Old English Safird, literally meaning the keeper of sheep. The occupation begins appearing in surname records from the late 1100s onward, in a country whose entire medieval economic engine ran on wool for the better part of several centuries. Britain built much of its early wealth on the backs of sheep, and the man who watched over the flock walked away with a surname that outlasted the medieval wool trade itself by several centuries. Number 11, Knight. This one is genuinely older than it sounds. Long before knight meant an armored man on horseback carrying a lance, the Old English knight simply meant a boy, a servant, or a young man attached to someone else's household. The surname appears in exactly that earlier and humbler sense from the 11th century, well before the more romantic chivalric meaning had fully developed. A knight, originally, was simply a young household retainer. The glamorous medieval upgrade came later and was layered on top. The surname survived through both meanings and still carries the weight of both today. Every knight appearing on a school attendance register is technically carrying a word that once meant nothing more than boy, long before it ever meant Sir Lancelot. Number 10, Walsh. This is the one surname on the list that quietly tells you, just through the word itself, that the family originally came from somewhere else. Walsh, along with Welsh and the medieval form Wales, descends from the Old English wheel, meaning foreigner, or more specifically Briton. It was a word the Anglo-Saxons used for the island's original Celtic-speaking inhabitants. The surname appears in the Domesday Book of 1086. By the time the Saxons were handing out this label, they had already lived in Britain for roughly 6 centuries, and had apparently decided that the Celts, whose ancestors had occupied the island for around 2,000 years longer, were the real foreigners. There are tens of thousands of Walshes across Britain today. The name is, technically speaking, an ancient insult that nobody ever got around to reclaiming. Number 9, Hatt. Here we have to slow down, because the claim attached to this particular name is one of the boldest in all of English surname history, and the actual evidence behind it is genuinely thin. The story, repeated across Surname reference books for the better part of 160 years, holds that Hatt is the single oldest English surname on record. It supposedly refers to an Anglo-Saxon family in East Anglia mentioned in a document predating the Norman conquest entirely, which would make the name well over 1,000 years old. The problem is that the document itself is undated. The Victorian scholar who first identified it, Robert Ferguson, writing in 1864, said only that it had, in his words, every appearance of predating the conquest. He added that if this interpretation were correct, Hatt would be the oldest surname on record. That is not the same thing as proof. A large share of what circulates online about surname origins is Victorian-era romantic guesswork, repeated ever since, as though it were settled historical fact. The Hatts may genuinely be ancient, and they may even predate the Norman conquest. But the entire case rests on one undated manuscript examined by exactly one historian back in 1864. Keep that in mind the next time somebody tells you, with complete confidence, exactly what their family name means and precisely how far back it goes. Number 8, Bulmer. The surname comes from the village of Bulmer in North Yorkshire. The Domesday Book of 1086 records the manor of Bulmer as being held by a Norman tenant under Robert, Count of Morton, William the Conqueror's own half-brother. By the 12th century, the family holding that land had adopted the place name itself as their surname, de Bulmer, meaning of Bulmer. That surname has passed down largely intact into the present day, 800 or 900 years and counting. Nearly every English surname derived from a place name follows the same basic pattern. Look at almost any village across northern England, and you may find in the parish records descendants of families who lived on that land centuries ago. In some cases, they never truly left, and neither did the name. Number 7, Stewart. This is Scotland's entry on the list. The surname comes from the Old English stigward, meaning the keeper of a household or hall. The word evolved through Norman French and eventually became associated with the Scottish royal office of steward. Walter FitzAlan, a Breton knight, was appointed the first hereditary High Steward of Scotland by King David I around the year 1150. His descendants eventually adopted Stewart as their family surname. 8 generations later, in 1371, a Stewart took the Scottish throne outright. 2 centuries after that, in 1603, another Stewart inherited the English throne as well, ruling as James VI of Scotland and James I of England. The House of Stewart, eventually respelled along French lines, went on to rule Britain for well over a century. The name began as a job title more than 800 years ago, and the family rose from that office all the way to a crown. Number 6, Pomeroy. The Pomeroys are about as genuine as this kind of historical surname claim gets. In 1066, a Norman knight named Ralph de la Pomeroy crossed the Channel alongside William the Conqueror. By 1086, his name appeared directly in the Domesday Book, recorded as holding 98 properties across Devon, 2 more in Somerset, and 1 in Cornwall. He built Barry Pomeroy Castle, which remained in his family's possession continuously until 1549. The surname itself comes from Pomeroy, the old French word for an apple orchard, referring to the family's original estate back in Normandy. If you carry the surname Pomeroy today, your family line may, in a genuine number of cases, be traceable through an unbroken documentary record stretching back roughly 940 years. Number 5, Lacy. Walter de Lacy fought at the Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October, 1066. He took his surname from the village of Lacy in Calvados, Normandy, where his family had already held land for generations before crossing into England. By 1086, the de Lacy family controlled vast estates across Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and Herefordshire. The surname traveled through 9 centuries of English history, surviving baronial revolts, the 100 Years' War, and the Wars of the Roses, and it still appears today in ordinary British records and directories, usually spelled Lacy or Lacy. The shape of the word has barely changed at all. Number 4, Beaumont. The surname comes from the Old French Beaumont, meaning the beautiful hill. The Beaumonts descend from Roger de Beaumont, a Norman nobleman who advised William the Conqueror personally, but remained in Normandy during the invasion, while his sons crossed the Channel and fought in his place. The family later produced 2 of the most powerful earls in early Norman England, Robert de Beaumont, the first Earl of Leicester, and Henry de Beaumont, the first Earl of Warwick. The Earldom of Warwick they founded eventually passed through marriage into other family lines, but the surname Beaumont itself, in several related spellings, has continued through English records for roughly 940 years. Number 3, Percy. The Percy family also arrived with the Conqueror. William de Percy, born in Normandy around the year 1040, appears in the Domesday Book of 1086 as a major landholder across Yorkshire. Over the medieval period, the family rose to become the Earls of Northumberland, the great northern dynasty, holders of Alnwick Castle, and a persistent thorn in the side of successive English kings. Their private feuds and rebellions became the backbone of several of Shakespeare's history plays. Hotspur, in Henry IV, Part 1, was Henry Percy, killed at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. The family carried on regardless. They still hold Alnwick Castle today. The current Duke of Northumberland is Ralph Percy, the 12th Duke, and the family line, through both direct descent and an 18th century marriage that restored the name, traces all the way back to the same Norman knight who landed in England nearly 960 years ago. Number 2, Smith. Smith is the single most common surname in Britain today. Roughly 1 in every 85 people you pass on the street is a Smith. The reason it is so common is exactly the same reason it is so old. In the medieval economy, every village, no matter how small, needed a working blacksmith. Iron was needed for nails, horseshoes, plowshares, scythes, knives, hinges, and even the metal hoops holding a cooper's barrels together. The word itself is Old English, smid, and it appears as a personal byname as far back as the late 900s. A manumission record from Durham even names one Eckhard Smith, a freed slave, roughly 100 years before the Norman conquest. Whether the name was strictly hereditary that early is genuinely difficult to prove with certainty, but Smith has remained in continuous documented English use from that point straight through to today, more than 1,000 years, give or take, of Smiths. Number 1, O'Brien. And here we have to step outside England entirely because the single oldest hereditary surname anywhere in the British Isles isn't English at all, it's Irish. In the year 1014, on Good Friday, an army led by the High King of Ireland defeated a coalition of Viking and Leinster forces at the Battle of Clontarf, just outside what is now Dublin. The High King himself, a 73-year-old man named Brian Boru, was killed in his own tent at the moment of victory. That event was recorded in datable historical sources, including the Annals of the Four Masters and the Annals of Ulster. By that point, Brian Boru had unified most of Ireland under a single rule. A generation after his death, his grandson, Tadg Ua Briain, adopted the name Ua Briain, meaning grandson of Brian, as a fixed hereditary surname. By the 11th century, the O'Brien family of Munster was already using that name in continuous, documented succession. It has passed through a full 1,000 years of Irish history, through English colonization, the famine-era diaspora, and migration into Britain, America, Australia, and far beyond. And it still appears today, unbroken, in ordinary modern directories across 5 continents. By a real margin, it stands as the oldest documented family surname, still in active use anywhere in the British Isles. It is older than the Tower of London, older than the Domesday Book, and older than the Norman conquest itself by roughly half a century. Every other name on this list either arrived with the Normans or was already sitting in England waiting for them. The O'Briens didn't need the conquest to happen at all. Their surname was already around 60 years old by the time it did. 15 surnames, 15 unbroken threads of human inheritance, running from a village blacksmith in 10th century Wessex, a Norman knight on horseback at Hastings, or an aging Irish king killed in his tent in the rain, straight down to the name currently sitting on your bank card. Nobody alive today chose it. It was simply handed to you, and you will hand it on in turn. Somewhere at the beginning of that long chain was one original person, the first Smith, the first Walsh, the first Hatt, who either chose that word themselves or had it chosen for them, and quietly began a line that has never once stopped since. If your surname appeared somewhere on this list, tell me exactly where your particular line entered the story. The village, the county, the family story your grandmother swore was true and later turned out to be accurate, or the one that turned out to be pure Victorian invention. And if your surname isn't on this list at all, tell me which one is missing, what it actually means, and just how far back you've managed to trace it.